People always ask when my life changed, and they expect me to name some grand achievement or devastating loss. The truth is far simpler. It changed the moment my best friend's father looked up from a stack of blueprints, smiled politely, and said, "You must be Ethan." Looking back now, I realized that summer never really ended. 3 years ago, I thought I was just taking another temporary job to help pay tuition before my final year of college. Ryan Carter, my best friend since freshman year of high school, had just landed a prestigious architecture internship in Italy. The day before his flight, he called me with the excitement only Ryan could have. "My dad needs help organizing one of his restoration projects," he said. "Mostly scanning old drawings, sorting documents, and creating digital files. Easy money, great experience, and honestly, he'll probably work you too hard because that's who he is." I laughed because that sounded exactly like Daniel Carter, at least from everything I had heard over the years. Ryan talked about his father with equal parts admiration and frustration. Daniel was one of the most respected architects in Boston, known for bringing forgotten historic buildings back to life instead of replacing them with glass towers. He rarely took vacations, answered emails before sunrise, and somehow managed to make every conversation sound like a business meeting. I had seen him a handful of times during birthdays and graduation parties. He was always courteous but distant, dressed in crisp button-down shirts with rolled sleeves, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades solving impossible problems. He never stayed long enough for real conversations. To me, he was simply Ryan's dad. The following Monday, I drove 45 minutes along the coast toward the Carter family home with an overnight bag, a laptop, and more nerves than I wanted to admit. Ryan had warned me that the project could last most of the summer and that staying in the guest house would save me hours of commuting every week. As I turned into the long gravel driveway, towering maple trees formed a canopy overhead, their leaves dancing in the warm July breeze. Beyond them stood a weathered cedar house overlooking the Atlantic, timeless without trying to impress anyone. It didn't feel like a mansion. It felt lived in, as though every creaking porch board and faded window frame had been carefully preserved because they held memories worth keeping. I climbed the front steps, adjusted the strap of my backpack, and knocked once. A few quiet seconds passed before the door opened. Daniel Carter stood there wearing jeans, a faded navy t-shirt, and reading glasses that rested lower than expected on his nose. Instead of the intimidating executive I had imagined, he looked like a man who had forgotten to stop working long enough to notice summer had arrived. He offered a small smile that reached his tired blue eyes. "You made good time," he said. "Come in, Ethan. I appreciate you helping me." His voice was calm, warm, almost unexpectedly gentle. As I stepped inside, I noticed sunlight spilling across rolled architectural drawings, coffee mugs scattered beside thick history books, and silence filling every corner of the house. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind left behind after years of someone living alone, so familiar that it had become part of the walls themselves. I couldn't explain why, but before unpacking a single box or opening a single file, I had the strange feeling that this house had been waiting for something far longer than a summer project. The next morning I woke just after 6 because the sound of waves carried through the open window of the guest house instead of traffic outside my apartment. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I remembered the towering shelves of blueprints, the quiet smile Daniel had offered at the front door, and the long summer stretching ahead of me. By the time I walked across the stone path toward the main house, the kitchen already smelled like fresh coffee. Daniel stood at the counter reading through a thick project binder while a cast iron skillet warmed on the stove. He glanced up with the same calm expression as the evening before. "Good morning, Ethan. I hope you slept well." I admitted that I had not slept that peacefully in months, and he nodded as if that answer pleased him more than he expected. Breakfast was simple: scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit, and coffee, but something about the quiet routine felt strangely comforting. We talked about the restoration project instead of personal lives. The property belonged to a century-old seaside library that had survived storms, changing ownership, and decades of neglect. Every drawing on Daniel's table represented another piece of history that deserved to be protected rather than forgotten. He spoke about old buildings the way other people talked about family members, with patience, respect, and genuine affection. After breakfast, he led me upstairs to a spacious office overlooking the ocean. Sunlight poured across drafting tables covered with rolled sketches, faded photographs, and carefully labeled folders. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, filled with architecture, history, engineering, and travel journals collected over many years. My job seemed straightforward. Scan every original drawing, organize thousands of digital files, compare them with handwritten restoration notes, and build an archive that future architects could actually navigate. It sounded repetitive until I realized every page carried someone's handwriting, someone's ideas, and sometimes corrections made 50 years apart. Daniel never rushed through the work. He examined every sheet before handing it to me, explaining why a single pencil mark could reveal how an entire building had evolved. Hours slipped away without either of us noticing. We worked mostly in comfortable silence, interrupted only when he shared an interesting story about a forgotten courthouse or an abandoned train station he had spent years restoring. During lunch, I finally understood why Ryan had called his father impossible to keep up with. Daniel hardly seemed aware of time. I reminded him to eat because he was still reviewing measurements while his sandwich sat untouched beside him. He looked almost embarrassed before thanking me with a quiet laugh that softened the lines around his eyes. It was the first time I had seen him relax. Later that afternoon, I carried several storage boxes down to the basement archive. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, and every shelf held another chapter of someone else's life. As I reached for the final box, I noticed an old framed family photograph leaning against the wall. Ryan looked about 10 years old, grinning beside a woman with kind eyes whose hand rested gently on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel stepped into the room before I could ask about it. He carefully picked up the frame, brushed away a thin layer of dust, and looked at it for a few quiet seconds before placing it back exactly where it had been. Neither of us spoke. We simply returned upstairs and continued working, but something had shifted. Until that moment, I had only seen Ryan's hard-working father. Now I realized I was sharing a house with someone who had been carrying silence for far longer than I could have imagined. By the end of the first week, the rhythm of the house had become strangely familiar. Every morning began with coffee brewing before sunrise. Every afternoon disappeared beneath stacks of aging documents, and every evening ended with the sound of waves rolling against the rocky shoreline outside. I had expected the work to feel repetitive, but Daniel had an incredible way of turning every blueprint into a story. He never spoke only about measurements or construction materials. Instead, he described the families who had gathered inside old town halls, the children who had once borrowed books from forgotten libraries, and the generations who had walked through doors that still stood because someone had chosen preservation instead of demolition. Listening to him made architecture feel less like a profession and more like protecting memories. One afternoon, the scanner suddenly stopped working in the middle of a large batch of drawings. I apologized, assuming I had done something wrong, but Daniel simply smiled and rolled up his sleeves. Together we sat on the hardwood floor surrounded by cables, instruction manuals, and scattered folders while we tried to figure out the problem. After nearly 30 minutes, he laughed quietly when he realized the machine had simply overheated. It was the first genuine laugh I had heard from him, and it transformed his entire face. The tired expression disappeared for a moment, replaced by warmth that made him seem years younger. I found myself smiling without even realizing it. Later that evening, we ordered pizza because neither of us felt like cooking after spending the entire day working. We carried our plates onto the back porch where the ocean breeze softened the lingering heat of July. The conversation drifted away from work for the first time. Daniel asked about my parents, my classes, and why I had chosen architecture. I admitted that I had never been certain whether I was talented enough to succeed. There were so many brilliant students at school that it often felt easier to doubt myself than to believe I belonged. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked toward the horizon before speaking. He said that confidence was rarely something people started with. Most of the architects he admired had spent years questioning themselves. The important part was continuing anyway because buildings, like people, became stronger through careful revision rather than instant perfection. His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. A few days later, I noticed something else. Every evening, almost at the same time, Daniel walked into the small garden behind the house carrying a watering can even when the forecast called for rain. Curious, I eventually joined him. The garden was filled with white roses, lavender, and climbing hydrangeas that had clearly been cared for with remarkable patience. Daniel rested one hand against an old wooden arbor before quietly explaining that his late wife had designed the entire space herself. He smiled gently as he spoke about her love of flowers, not with overwhelming sadness, but with quiet gratitude, as though every bloom allowed a small part of her kindness to remain. There was no dramatic silence, no heartbreaking confession, only honest remembrance. As we walked back toward the house, I realized the loneliness I had sensed on my first day was not empty after all. It was filled with memories that Daniel carried every single day, choosing to honor them instead of hiding from them. For reasons I could not explain, I no longer saw him simply as my best friend's father or my employer. I saw a man who had devoted himself to preserving beautiful things, whether they were old buildings, treasured gardens, or the love that had shaped his life. And somewhere deep inside me, I began wondering who had ever taken the time to preserve him. The middle of July arrived almost without either of us noticing because every day settled into a rhythm that felt natural in a way I had never expected. Mornings belonged to coffee and quiet conversations over the kitchen counter before we climbed the stairs to the office. Afternoons disappeared inside old blueprints and restoration notes, interrupted only by the sound of gulls drifting in from the shoreline. Evenings became something entirely different. Without discussing it, we started ending each workday with a walk along the narrow path that followed the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Sometimes we talked about architecture. Sometimes we talked about books. Sometimes we simply watched the waves roll toward shore while the sky slowly turned shades of orange and violet. I realized those silent walks had become my favorite part of every day. One Saturday, the weather was unusually clear, and Daniel suggested visiting the library we were restoring. The building sat only a few miles away, wrapped in scaffolding with sections carefully protected beneath white canvas. As we stepped inside, sunlight poured through tall windows covered with years of dust, filling the empty reading room with golden light. Daniel spoke with remarkable enthusiasm, pointing out carved wooden details, original stonework, and tiny design decisions that most people would never notice. Watching him explain every corner of the building reminded me of someone introducing an old friend rather than inspecting a construction site. His passion was impossible not to admire. On the drive home, we stopped at a small family-owned diner overlooking the harbor. The waitress greeted Daniel by name and smiled warmly before asking if he wanted his usual order. He introduced me as the student helping with the restoration project, and she joked that it was nice to see him bringing someone out into the world instead of hiding inside blueprints all summer. Daniel laughed, shaking his head with quiet embarrassment, while I found myself laughing with him. It was another side of him that Ryan had never described, someone respected not because of his reputation, but because of his kindness. Back at the house that evening, I noticed a loose shutter outside the guest house banging softly in the breeze. Before I could find a ladder, Daniel was already carrying one across the yard. We spent nearly an hour fixing the old hinge together while trading stories about disastrous home repairs we had each attempted in the past. At one point, I lost my balance for a split second, and Daniel instinctively reached out to steady my shoulder before I stepped safely back onto the ground. The gesture lasted no more than a heartbeat, completely natural and innocent, yet I became strangely aware of how reassuring his presence felt. He quickly asked if I was all right, and I answered that I was. But for reasons I could not explain, my heart took longer to settle than my footing had. Neither of us mentioned the moment again. That night, I sat on the porch of the guest house long after the lights inside the main house had gone out. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and lavender from the garden, and I found myself replaying countless ordinary moments from the past 2 weeks. The shared meals, the conversations about forgotten buildings, the laughter over broken equipment, the evening walks, and the quiet understanding that had somehow formed without either of us trying. Nothing dramatic had happened. There had been no grand confession, no impossible promise, and no line crossed between us. Yet somewhere inside those simple routines, the distance between employer and assistant had quietly begun to disappear, replaced by a friendship that felt effortless, genuine, and unexpectedly important. As I looked toward the softly lit windows of the main house, a thought entered my mind so unexpectedly that I immediately tried to push it away. I realized I was already wondering what this place would feel like when summer finally came to an end. The following week brought the kind of weather that made every hour outside feel like a gift. Warm sunlight filled the mornings, cool ocean air softened the evenings, and the restoration project steadily moved closer to completion. We had fallen into an easy partnership without ever talking about it. Daniel no longer needed to explain where files belonged because I already understood his system. I no longer hesitated before offering suggestions because he listened carefully, sometimes smiling before admitting that my approach was actually better than his own. Every small success felt shared. One afternoon, we drove back to the library to review the latest restoration work. As local volunteers finished cleaning the original reading room, Daniel quietly stepped aside to let them celebrate their progress. Watching him thank every carpenter, electrician, and painter by name reminded me that leadership was not something he demanded. It was something he earned through genuine respect. On the drive home, dark clouds gathered over the coastline far sooner than either of us expected. By the time we reached the narrow road leading back to the house, heavy summer rain was falling so hard that the windshield wipers could barely keep up. Daniel slowed the truck, focusing carefully on the winding road while thunder rolled somewhere over the Atlantic. When we finally pulled into the driveway, neither of us made a run for the house. Instead, we sat quietly for a moment, listening to the rain strike the roof above us. Daniel smiled faintly and said that storms always reminded him how small people really were compared to nature. I answered that perhaps that was why moments of peace mattered so much. He looked at me for a second longer than usual before nodding in quiet agreement. Inside the house, the electricity flickered once before settling into a warm glow. Since the storm showed no sign of ending, we decided to leave the project until morning. Daniel suggested making dinner together instead of ordering takeout. The evening became unexpectedly lighthearted. I chopped vegetables while he prepared homemade pasta sauce using a recipe he admitted he had learned from his late wife many years before. We laughed when I nearly added twice as much seasoning as the recipe called for, and he teased me that architects should always measure before improvising. For the first time since arriving, the house echoed with easy laughter instead of silence. After dinner, the rain continued, tapping softly against every window while we carried 2 mugs of tea onto the covered back porch. The garden glistened beneath the porch lights, every flower sparkling beneath tiny drops of water. Neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. It was peaceful simply sitting there, watching the storm drift slowly out to sea. After several quiet minutes, Daniel spoke almost to himself. He admitted that the house had not felt this alive in a very long time. His words were simple, spoken without drama, yet they settled deeply inside me. I answered honestly that I had begun thinking of the place as more than a temporary job. It had started to feel like somewhere I belonged. Daniel turned toward me with an expression I could not quite read, one filled with gratitude, surprise, and something quieter that neither of us was ready to name. Before either of us could say another word, my phone buzzed across the small wooden table. The screen lit up with Ryan's name, followed by a message that read, "Good news. My internship is ending earlier than expected. I will be home next week." The peaceful evening suddenly felt different, not because anything between Daniel and me had changed, but because I realized the quiet world we had built together was about to be tested in ways neither of us had anticipated. Ryan's message lingered in the back of my mind long after I set my phone down. Until that moment, the passing weeks had felt strangely suspended from the rest of the world, as though the quiet house overlooking the Atlantic existed outside ordinary time. Now reality was returning. Ryan was coming home. The restoration project was nearly finished, and the life I had built inside those peaceful routines suddenly seemed temporary again. The next morning, nothing appeared different on the surface. Daniel greeted me with coffee, reviewed our schedule for the day, and we drove to the library to inspect the latest restoration work. Yet I noticed small changes that probably would have escaped anyone else. He grew quieter whenever conversation drifted toward the end of summer. He checked his calendar more often than usual. Several times I caught him looking out the tall windows before returning his attention to the drawings spread across the table. It was as if he had already begun preparing himself to let something go before it was actually gone. That afternoon, we stopped at a hardware store to pick up materials for a display case that would eventually hold historical photographs inside the library. As we loaded lumber into the truck, an older gentleman greeted Daniel by name. After exchanging a few friendly words, the man smiled at me and casually asked if I was Daniel's son. For one brief second, neither of us answered. Daniel politely explained that I was helping with the restoration project, and the man apologized with an easy laugh before wishing us both a good afternoon. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but the silence that followed stayed with us all the way back to the house. It was not uncomfortable. It simply carried questions neither of us knew how to ask. That evening, I found Daniel standing alone in the garden, trimming a few rose branches that had begun to lean beneath their own weight. I walked over and quietly helped gather the fallen leaves without saying anything. After several minutes, he finally spoke. He admitted that Ryan had called earlier to confirm his flight details and that he was looking forward to seeing his son again. His smile was genuine, but there was another emotion beneath it that I could not quite identify. I told him Ryan had been counting the days until he came home as well. Daniel nodded before looking toward the ocean beyond the garden fence. He said that life had a way of changing just when people finally became comfortable. The words felt simple, yet they settled heavily between us. Later that night, I returned to the guest house and began packing a few things into my overnight bag, even though I still had several days left before the project officially ended. Folding my clothes suddenly felt symbolic, as though I was quietly preparing myself to leave behind far more than a temporary place to stay. The following morning, I carried another completed archive box into Daniel's office. He reviewed the final files, closed the lid carefully, and thanked me for work that had exceeded every expectation. Then he surprised me by saying that he had not only appreciated my help, he had appreciated my company. His voice remained calm and professional, yet there was unmistakable sincerity behind every word. I smiled, unsure how to answer without revealing how deeply those words affected me. For a long moment, we simply looked at one another across the office filled with blueprints, morning sunlight, and the quiet life we had unknowingly built together. Then the distant sound of a car turning into the long gravel driveway broke the silence. Daniel glanced toward the front window, and without saying a word, both of us knew that the peaceful season we had shared was coming to an end. Ryan burst through the front door carrying 2 suitcases and the same easy grin I had known for years. He wrapped his father in a quick hug before pulling me into another one, immediately filling the quiet house with stories about crowded train stations, late nights in Florence, and everything he had managed to sketch during his internship. Daniel listened with patient pride, asking thoughtful questions while setting an extra plate on the table for lunch. Watching them together reminded me how much they genuinely cared for one another, even if they expressed it differently. For the rest of the afternoon, the house felt livelier than it had all summer. Ryan wandered through the office, amazed by how much work we had completed. He teased me for becoming more organized than he had ever seen me before and joked that his father had probably turned me into a perfectionist. Daniel smiled more that day than I had seen in weeks, yet every now and then our eyes met across the room before quickly looking away again. It was a small change, almost impossible for anyone else to notice, but I felt it every time. That evening, Ryan insisted we celebrate his return by grilling dinner outside. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the ocean, the 3 of us sat around the patio table, sharing stories that stretched late into the evening. Ryan talked about the people he had met overseas, while Daniel listened with quiet admiration. At one point, Ryan laughed and said that leaving me behind with his father had been the best decision he made all summer because the 2 of us clearly worked well together. Neither Daniel nor I answered immediately. Ryan noticed the brief silence, but simply smiled, assuming we were both tired after weeks of work. The following morning, Ryan offered to help organize the final archive boxes before the library presentation scheduled for the end of the week. We spent hours sorting photographs, labeling storage cases, and preparing displays that would remain part of the restored building for years to come. As Ryan stepped outside to answer a phone call, Daniel quietly handed me an old leather notebook filled with restoration sketches. He thanked me once again for treating every page with the same care he would have given it himself. I told him that preserving history had taught me far more than any summer class ever could. Before either of us could continue, Ryan returned unexpectedly. He stopped just inside the office doorway, looking from me to his father with a thoughtful expression that replaced his usual carefree smile. Nothing inappropriate had happened. We were simply standing close together over an open notebook, speaking softly in the peaceful office that had become so familiar to both of us. Even so, Ryan seemed to notice something neither Daniel nor I had been willing to admit aloud. He said nothing for the rest of the afternoon, but his laughter became quieter and his eyes lingered on us a little longer than before. That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I stepped onto the guest house porch hoping the cool ocean air would clear my thoughts. Instead, I saw Ryan walking slowly across the yard carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to me without a word and leaned against the porch railing beside me. For several minutes, we watched the moonlight shimmer across the Atlantic in complete silence before he finally spoke in a calm voice that carried neither anger nor accusation. He looked straight ahead and quietly asked, "Ethan, is there something the two of you have not been telling me?" Ryan's question hung in the cool night air, carried only by the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. I stared into my coffee for several long seconds before finally answering with complete honesty. I told him that nothing had happened between his father and me, because that was still true. There had been no promises, no confession, and no line crossed. What I could not deny was that somewhere during the endless mornings of blueprints and quiet evenings by the ocean, Daniel had become someone I cared about far more deeply than I had ever expected. Ryan listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and looked toward the main house where a single light still glowed in his father's office. He admitted that he had started noticing little things over the past 2 days. The way the house felt warmer than he remembered. The way his father laughed more easily. The way both of us seemed completely comfortable sharing silence. None of those things were wrong, yet together they told a story he could not ignore. I apologized, afraid I had somehow betrayed his trust without ever intending to. Ryan shook his head before I could say anything else. He reminded me that friendship had always meant telling the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Then he quietly asked the question I had been avoiding myself. "Do you think you are falling in love with him?" I could not answer immediately because hearing the words spoken aloud made them impossible to hide behind uncertainty anymore. After a long silence, I nodded once. Ryan closed his eyes for a brief moment before giving a small, thoughtful smile that surprised me. He confessed that after his mother passed away, he had watched his father slowly disappear into work. Every restoration project became another excuse to avoid an empty house. Every award meant less than the family dinners they no longer shared. Ryan had spent years hoping someone might remind Daniel that life was meant to be lived, not simply preserved. He admitted that during the weeks he had been away, every phone call with his father sounded different. Lighter, more present, more alive. The next morning, I found Daniel alone in the office before breakfast, carefully packing the final project files into archival boxes. He looked up as I entered, immediately sensing that something had changed. Before I could explain, he quietly said that he had already decided what needed to happen. He thanked me for everything I had brought into the house, but he believed it would be best if I returned to my apartment after the library presentation. He said I deserved a future without unnecessary complications, and he refused to become the reason my friendship with Ryan might suffer. His voice never wavered, but I could see the sadness behind every carefully chosen word. For the first time all summer, I disagreed with him. I told him that deciding alone did not protect anyone. It only guaranteed that all 3 of us would lose something important. Before either of us could continue, Ryan appeared quietly in the doorway. Neither of us had heard him approach. He looked from his father to me, then offered a calm smile that carried none of the tension I had feared. In an even voice he said, "Both of you keep making decisions because you think they protect someone else. Maybe it is time you ask what actually makes each of you happy." The room fell completely silent, because in that single sentence Ryan had said what neither Daniel nor I had been brave enough to admit to ourselves. Ryan's words remained with us long after the conversation ended. None of us tried to force an answer that morning because some truths deserve time instead of pressure. The library dedication took place 2 days later beneath bright August skies. Families wandered through restored reading rooms. Children explored shelves that had been empty only weeks before, and local historians thanked Daniel for preserving another piece of the town's story. I stood quietly near the back, watching visitors admire details that I had scanned, organized, and cataloged one page at a time. When the mayor invited Daniel to say a few words, he spoke about the importance of protecting places that reminded people where they came from. Then, before stepping away from the podium, he surprised everyone by thanking the young architect who had helped breathe new life into the project. As the audience applauded, he looked directly at me with unmistakable gratitude. That evening, after the last guests had gone home, I packed the final box into my car. The guest house looked exactly as it had on the day I arrived, yet it no longer felt like a temporary place. It felt like a chapter of my life I was afraid to close. Daniel walked me to the driveway in the fading light. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he admitted that asking me to leave had been the hardest decision he had made in years because every logical reason told him to let me go, while every honest feeling wished I could stay. I smiled sadly and answered that I had spent weeks pretending I only admired him when the truth had become impossible to ignore. I cared about the man he was, not because he was Ryan's father or because he had built an extraordinary career, but because he had shown me that kindness could be quiet, patience could change lives, and even the loneliest house could feel like home again. Before either of us could say anything more, Ryan stepped onto the porch carrying 3 glasses of lemonade. He laughed softly and said we were making farewell conversations far too dramatic. Then he looked at both of us with complete sincerity. He reminded us that people spent too much of their lives running away from happiness because they feared what others might think. He had already lost one parent far too early to believe that pretending was a better choice than living honestly. His only request was simple. If we ever chose to build a future together, it had to be because it brought genuine peace into our lives and never because either of us felt guilty. 3 years have passed since that unforgettable summer. The restored library remains one of my favorite projects, but it is no longer the greatest thing that came from those months beside the Atlantic. Daniel and I eventually opened a small architecture studio together, focusing on preserving historic buildings that many people believed were beyond saving. Ryan became one of our closest collaborators, often teasing that he accidentally introduced the 2 most stubborn architects in New England. Every summer we still return to the cedar house overlooking the ocean. The garden continues to bloom with white roses and lavender. The porch still catches the evening breeze, and the silence that once filled every room has been replaced by conversation, laughter, and the comforting sounds of people choosing to share their lives. Whenever someone asks when everything changed, I always think back to that ordinary summer job. I accepted it hoping to earn a little money before my final year of college. I never imagined it would teach me that sometimes the most meaningful foundations are not built from stone or timber. They are built quietly, one ordinary day at a time, until you suddenly realize you have found the place and the people who feel like home.